Hello, welcome to this talk. My name's Dr. Edward Anderson, and I'm here today to give you a bit of introduction to the topic that I'm going to be talking more about in our live session in a couple of weeks on the topic of international trade and trading blocks. So I'm a lecturer in the School of Global Development at the University of East Anglia. There's a couple of pictures of our lovely campus. Just outside Norwich in East Anglia. And so let's make a start. So here's really an overview of what I want to talk about in the next 15 minutes or so. So I think this is a really interesting topic. I think it has a lot of relevance to if you're studying geography or economics or business or politics. We're going to be talking about trade agreements, international trade agreements. And as I'm going to show that these have become really popular since the 1990s. More and more countries are entering into these things, wanting to join trade agreements. But there's still a lot of debate and controversy about whether these things really are beneficial or not. So that's what we're going to really be thinking about in this session. On the one hand, we're going to think about what's their relationship to globalization. Do they contribute to globalization, or are they actually a hindrance to globalization, counterintuitive as that might seem? We're then going to ask whether they really benefit the countries that are entering into these agreements. Just because they're popular doesn't mean they're beneficial. Countries might be going into forming these agreements without actually realizing whether they're beneficial or not. And we're also going to have to think about what about the countries that are left out of these sorts of agreements? How are they affected? And then we're also going to look at some of the implications for politics. It's not just about economics and business. We'll see that trade agreements also have quite big implications for democracy and how we make decisions about the laws and regulations that govern our lives. So really big topic, really interesting topic. I'm looking forward to discussing and debating some of these questions with you. So let me begin with some definitions. So just so that we're all starting from the same page. So we're going to be talking about trade agreements. Basically, that's the definition. We're talking about agreements between two or more countries to reduce trade barriers amongst themselves, but to maintain their trade barriers with countries outside of the agreement. So when we're talking about trade barriers, we're talking about things like quotas, import quotas, so like just restrictions on the amount of a product that can be imported into a country. That's a trade barrier. Or tariffs. So a tariff is like a tax on imports. And that's also a barrier to trade because it makes imported goods more expensive. So things like tariffs and quotas are trade barriers. But when countries form a trade agreement, they agree to reduce and eventually eliminate those things. Now, these trade agreements come under various different names. So sometimes they're called regional trade agreements when the countries are from the same region. Sometimes they're called preferential trade agreements, or sometimes they're just called trading blocks. But in all cases, this is the basic definition that I'm going to be using and that most people will use. Now, there are two main types of trade agreements that you might have heard of and that are often talked about. First one is what we call a free trade area. So in this case, this is where the countries agree to have no trade barriers amongst themselves, but each country is free to choose its own trade barriers with countries outside of the agreement. So each country can decide, well, what tariff am I going to have with countries outside the agreement? That's completely up to each country in the trade area to decide for themselves. Second type is different though. So this is what we call a customs union. And this is again where the countries agree to have no trade barriers amongst themselves, no tariffs, no quotas. But they also agree to have the same tariffs with the rest of the world. So each country will agree, for example, okay, so we're we're going to have a 10% tariff on imported cars, or 20% on beef, 30% on tomatoes. Now, the important thing there is that they all have to follow those same tariffs with countries outside of the agreement. So it involves an extra level of agreement. But they're both examples of trade agreements. Now, another thing about trade agreements is that they represent a form of international economic integration. So they're one stage, often the first stage of a process, which can lead to more and more integration. So integration really means the process by which separate national economies become increasingly linked together. The barriers to economic flows of goods and services, money, investment are gradually removed. So as I said, trade agreements often represent one of the first stages of that process, removing barriers to trade. Now, in some cases, that's just the beginning of the process. So, for example, the European Union started off as a trade agreement and a customs union, but it's gone on to become a common market, and it's now a monetary union. So, a monetary union means the countries are now sharing the same currency. A common market means that not only do you have free trade, but you also have freedom of movement of labour, freedom of movement of capital, and so on. So, in some cases, trade agreements can be a first step towards further integration, like in the case of the European Union. But that's not necessarily the case. For some cases, some trade agreements, countries will say, well, this is as far as we want to go. We want a free trade agreement, a free trade area. We don't want to go any further. That's absolutely fine. So in this talk, I'm really only going to be discussing the trade agreements, the customs unions and the free trade areas. There's obviously a lot more issues to consider if we want to talk about a common market where you also have freedom of movement of labour and capital. Also, if you have a monetary union showing the same currency and monetary policy. So we can talk about those sorts of agreements more in our live session if you would like, but in this talk now I'm just going to focus on the trade agreements. Now, trade agreements have become much more popular than they were a few decades ago. So this graph here just shows you that. There's a big exponential rise in the number of trade agreements. They all have to be reported to the World Trade Organization, so it's quite easy to track the number. And if you go to the website of the World Trade Organization, you can actually access the full list of trade agreements. There are now over 300, and that's up from about 20 or so at the beginning of the 1980s. So a massive rise, one of the most striking developments of the world economy in recent decades. And virtually all countries in the world are now part of at least one type of a trade agreement, and sometimes many more. Some countries are members of multiple trade agreements. So that just gives you a sense of how popular they are becoming. Here are some examples of ones that you might well have heard of in different regions of the world. So all regions of the trade agreements exist in all regions of the world. Here are some examples that you can go and look up if you would like to. These are all examples of either free trade areas or customs unions in different regions of the world. Now, these are all, as you probably notice, that these are all examples of regional trade agreements. This is all cases where countries within the same reasonably within the same region, neighbouring countries are forming trade agreements. What we're also seeing now, more recently, is the rise of even larger, what's sometimes called mega trade agreements. So here are some examples. So the first one is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So here you've got 11 countries broadly speaking, bordering the Pacific, but obviously in quite different parts of the world. And it's also, that's a really big agreement. It's covering around 500 million people, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, about 15% of global GDP. And interestingly, now the UK has actually applied to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, indicating that there is no real geographical barrier to joining these agreements. If you want to, the UK is obviously not a Pacific country, but it still wants to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have a new African continental free trade area covering the whole of the continent. That will cover around 1 billion people and around over 50 countries. And we've also seen what's called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This will include 15 countries, but will be the biggest in terms of population, as it includes China. There'll be over 2 billion people included in this trade agreement, covering around 30% of global GDP. So we're seeing these really big new agreements being formed, covering countries from both high and middle income and low income countries from different parts of the world. So let's think about some of the questions then about trade agreements, beginning with their relationship with globalization. So if you're doing geography A-level, you might well have been learning about how trade agreements are viewed as a kind of a contributing factor to globalization, one of the causes of globalization. And that's certainly true to some extent. Obviously, trade agreements reduce barriers to trade. That's the kind of what they do, essentially, between the member countries. And that leads to more trade, more flows of goods and services between countries, part of globalization. They also do other important things. They help promote political support for free trade, because trade agreements are reciprocal. So if one country reduces its trade barriers, other countries do the same. That's likely to be viewed as fair by people and by businesses. You know, we get access to your markets. In return, you get access to our markets. That helps to promote political support for free trade, which is really important. And they're also easier to negotiate. Often trade agreements are formed between relatively small numbers of countries, and that means that they're easier to agree. And that is a big difference with the World Trade Organization, where you have over 150 countries. It's much harder to get them all to agree on reducing their trade barriers. So, not surprisingly, many people do view these as an important contributing factor to globalization. However, there is another side of the argument, and some people actually argue quite the opposite, is that they're actually detrimental. They've been referred to as termites in the world trading system. So, as you may know or may not know, but a termite is a very small insect that can, despite being small, can be very damaging. It can undermine structures, particularly anything made of wood. Termites will gradually eat their way through it and undermine its structure. And trade agreements are viewed by some people as having this similar sort of effect on the world trading system. And that's because they go against, or they conflict with, some of the basic principles of the world trading system. So the GATS, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, when that was set up in 1944, it was based on this important principle of non-discrimination. Basically, all WTO members should be treated the same. There shouldn't be sort of any preferential treatment for some WTO members over others. But with trade agreements, that's obviously no longer the case. Some WTO members will get better treatment, more preferential treatment, will face lower tariffs than others. And that's definitely not what the founding members of the GATT wanted. So the more of these trade agreements you have, the more it undermines that basic principle of the WTO of non-discrimination between member countries. And obviously, as more countries are spending more time trying to negotiate these smaller trade agreements, it makes it much harder to achieve an overall trade agreement that would cover all WTO countries. So it makes those trade negotiations at the World Trade Organization more difficult. So we end up actually with a very fragmented form of globalization, where we might have more trade within these trading blocs, but overall much less trade between them. And that's not really something we could refer to as globalization, perhaps. It might be more regionalization, or certainly a fragmented form of globalization. So if we think that is a problem, then what can we do about it? Is there a way of allowing, making sure that that trade agreements don't sort of undermine progress towards a truly global world trading system? Is something we can discuss maybe in our session in a couple of weeks. So next point is about the economics of trade agreements. Now, we know that they're popular, but do they actually benefit the countries? Now, this is an important question because for economists, because many economists will tell you about the principle of comparative advantage. If you've studied economics, you might have come across that. It's generally, the argument goes back to David Ricardo that countries benefit from trade. All countries have a comparative advantage in something, so that gives them something to export, and they benefit from exporting things that they are relatively good at, and in importing things that they are less good at. That's the principle of comparative advantage. So many people would think, okay, well, that means if trade is good, trade agreements must be good. But actually, trade agreements are not the same as free trade, because you're only reducing your trade barriers with some countries rather than others. And the first person who sort of studied this issue, noted that difference, was Jacob Weiner. And he said, well, actually, trade agreements don't necessarily benefit the member countries. But his point was that they will tend to benefit the countries if they lead to what's called trade creation. So trade creation is where you have higher cost domestic production being replaced by lower cost imports from other member countries. That's trade creation. So if you take an example, let's take sugar in the UK. So sugar in the UK can either be, we import some of our sugar, we import sugar cane, but we also produce some of our own sugar from sugar beet. Now, if we sign a trade agreement, let's say with Australia, and we end up importing sugar cane from Australia and producing less sugar from sugar beet ourselves, because it's cheaper, the imported sugar is cheaper, that's an example of trade creation. That's generally beneficial for a country. However, there's another possibility, and that is what's called trade diversion. So if we sign a trade agreement with Australia, there's a chance that we might end up importing more sugar from Australia, but only at the expense of importing less from other countries like Brazil. So if we simply end up importing more sugar from Australia and less from Brazil, that's an example of trade diversion. And that generally is harmful to a country. If your lower cost imports from non-member countries, like Brazil, let's say, sugar from Brazil, is being replaced by higher cost imports from a member country like Australia, for example. So the balance between those things is going to determine whether or not the trade agreement really is beneficial to a country. And we can talk more about the economics of this in our live session, if that would be of interest. But basically, the losses from trade diversion is due to the fact that when you have a trade agreement, set up a trade agreement, you lose a certain amount of tariff revenue. You're no longer getting government revenue from tariffs, but that loss of tariff revenue is not entirely offset by gains to consumers from lower prices. If you have trade diversion, it's that loss in tariff revenue is not going to be entirely offset by the gains to consumers from lower prices. That's why it's a problem. If it's trade creation, you're okay, but if it's trade diversion, there's a potential problem. So in our session, we can look at some of the evidence on that. What does the evidence suggest? Is there more trade creation or more trade diversion? And what perhaps can be done to avoid that problem of trade diversion? And we'll also talk about what are the impacts on non-member countries. So as we'll see, trade diversion can actually have an adverse effect on the non-member countries as well. So a country like Brazil, if the UK forms a trade agreement with Australia and then imports more sugar from Australia, that's going to have an adverse impact on Brazil, because it's no longer going to have such a large market for its exports. So, the final point I wanted to talk about is about politics. As I said at the start, trade agreements also have big impacts on politics and on our democracy. And the reason for that is that more and more so today, as trade agreements have become more popular, many of them now aim not only to reduce tariffs, but also to agree common rules and regulations on things like health and safety standards. So often the barriers to trade are not just tariffs, but they are regulations. So for example, in discussions between the United States and the UK about forming a potential trade agreement since Brexit, there's been a lot of discussion about this issue of chlorine-washed chicken. So this is an agricultural practice that's used in some countries, including the United States, involves washing chicken in chlorine before final sale. It's considered to be a perfectly safe practice in the United States, a way of just preventing any harmful bacteria that might have emerged during the production chain. But in the UK, it's banned. It's not considered to be it's considered to be a risk to health. So it's not allowed. So it's impossible for the US to export chicken at the moment to the UK. There's no, even if there was a tariff, it's just not possible. So in the negotiations for a trade agreement, this is something the United States has said, well, you need to start allowing our chlorine-washed chicken into the UK because our evidence suggests it's perfectly legal. It's perfectly healthy. There's no risk. Whereas many farming groups, consumer groups and so on in the UK say, well, no, actually, we want to follow our own advice. Our own scientific advice suggests that it is a risk to health. So really the issue becomes one of politics and who gets to choose our health and safety regulations. So, should the UK be free to choose its own health and safety regulations around things like chicken? Or should we actually follow the US regulations in order for us to get a trade deal? Which would obviously, there'd be lots of potential economic benefits from that, but we might have to accept United States regulations on health and safety of products like chicken. So really there's a sort of a trade-off between wanting to have what we might call frictionless trade, so not just zero tariffs, but also common rules and regulations between countries in our trade agreement. So on the one hand, we might want to have that for the economic benefits, but at the same time, what about our national democratic sovereignty and our ability to choose our own health and safety regulations, for example, rather than just having to follow what other countries in our trade agreement have. So that's a an introduction to the issues. There's a summary there. Seen that they've become extremely popular trade agreements, but that they remain controversial for those reasons. So those are the sorts of issues I'd like to come back to, talk more about when we meet again on the 25th of November, Monday the 25th of November. If you have any questions or other things that you would like to discuss or learn about, please feel free to send those in advance. Otherwise, look forward to seeing you live on Monday the 25th. Okay, many thanks.